You got your papers ready to go, ready to dive in? Let's turn to 2 Samuel, and let me tell you what we're skipping. And I'm at the part in David's life where I'm beginning to skip things. Some of it's a little hard to know how to teach it, and if we were in seminary, I guess we would have to, but I try to sort of focus on the parts that at least speak to me. When you teach the class, you can do it different. How's that? But I'm really going to skip this evening over chapters 1 to 5 of 2 Samuel. But let me tell you what's in there, and I'll tell you by the paper. I've mentioned it. I call it One Nation Under God, A Time to Weep. In chapter 1, before tackling the assignment of being king over Israel, David first paused to grieve the loss of Saul and Jonathan. If you'll remember, the last chapter of 1 Samuel is where Saul and Jonathan were killed in the battle on the Mount Gilboa. And so David grieves them. Though Saul had been an evil, murderous, and unjust autocrat, David nevertheless mourned the loss of Israel's first king. The contemporary gospel, in the American church particularly, of health, wealth, and happiness has little understanding of the place for lamentation. And this is a theme we've seen several times in David, but the second half of chapter 1, you'll see it's in poetry. It's a lament. He's singing, probably in a minor key, but how the mighty have fallen, tell it not in Gath. How the Jonathan and David, more beautiful than eagles. And it's quite you'd never know when he sings it that Saul was such a rascal. But I think it's good to just remember he pauses to grieve. He doesn't just rush on. He takes a moment to grieve. I find in America, and particularly the American evangelical church, we don't teach people how to grieve, and people try to move on. Let's move on. You'll hear that a lot even at funerals, and I want to say, don't move on. Just grieve for a little bit. But that's what David is doing. Chapter 2, I call it, chapter 2, 3, and 4, I called it A House Divided. Let me read you, I looked this up again today, Abraham Lincoln's 1858 House Divided speech. This is pretty good, and it relates. He was talking about a different house divided, but his words are meaningful to me. Lincoln said, this is 2 years before he was president, and about 2.5 years, 3 years maybe before the war, what we call the Civil War. There's nothing very civil about war, but he said this, a house divided against itself cannot stand. I do not believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other. That's a pretty insightful comment. I'd forgotten what he said, and he said, we can't be half slave and half free. We've got to be all one or all the other. Choose your sides. We can't. That's what David was facing in the divided kingdom. Israel couldn't be one nation under God and have a king named Ishbosheth, we're going to see him, and a king named David. You can't do that. You've got to have one or the other, which is often a call to arms. And I wonder in our day what kind of issues, if not us, but our children will face, where even as in America we say, we got to be one or the other. Some things you can agree to disagree on, but Lincoln said we can't agree to disagree on slavery. And the pro-slaves said the same thing. No, one of us is going to win this Some issues are, I put the footnote there. Many today, like in schools, they say, Lincoln is the origin of that phrase, a house divided. And it's like, it's so good to say, no, he's not. He knows his Bible. Jesus is the one who talked about a house divided. And Lincoln was a great orator because he read his Bible and he knew it very well. What kind of Christian he was, I'm not always real sure, but he knew his Bible. Some issues are so significant that tolerance is intolerable. A people must choose one path or the other. Neutrality is not an option. So what you've got now to make the application to Scripture, in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel, you see that David is anointed king in verse 4 over what? One tribe, his own tribe. So God had said way back in 1 Samuel, you're going to be king. So now he is king over one tribe. Is this what God meant? And then in verse 8 of chapter 2, and Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, who's now dead, but his general is still alive, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, who wasn't killed in the battle, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and he made him king over Gilead and the Asherites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all Israel. So you've got two kings over one nation. This was true in David's day. David is anointed king over the tribe of Judah. Ishbosheth is anointed king over the tribes of Israel, the 11 tribes. Israel thus has two kings, but no one can serve two masters. So that's what's going on in these chapters 2 to 4. You've got chaos. And some of the chaos, and this lasted 7.5 years, are in these points 1, 2, 3. The battle of Gibeon, and these, I hate to skip these, this is where they said, Abner and Joab said, let's get 12 men to come out and fight each other, and they each grabbed each other's beard and stabbed. So you had 24 men to die, and then everybody was fighting. And Asahel was chasing Abner, and Abner just stopped, and with the butt of his spear, speared him. I mean, these are, when I was a boy girl, these were great stories. They're just great war stories. Well then, because Abner killed Joab's brother, Joab, David's general, plans to take vengeance on Abner. So when Abner decides, because he wanted Saul's concubine, and Ishbosheth got upset and said, no, you can't have my daddy's concubine because that would mean you were the king, and Abner gets all bent out of shape. He goes to David and said, I'm going to deliver the 11 tribes to you. But Joab takes him aside and murders him in cold blood. And David, this is troubling, but David did nothing to Joab. I'm not going to read that. You can read it. But it's you can understand why I'm not teaching from these chapters, because it's like, what do you do with these stories? They're very interesting. But you've got this conflict of this house divided. But in chapter 5, verse 1, then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, behold, not just one tribe, but all 12. We are bone of your bone. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd over my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel. So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. 12 tribes. So now there's one king over all of Israel. This, politically and historically, this was a very important day. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. And what's the first thing they do? He needs a capital. And he didn't want his capital to be in Hebron because Hebron was a part of Judah, so he conquers Jerusalem. That's a big thing. The city of David. Jerusalem is the city of David, Mount Zion, where Abraham offered Isaac, where today there's a mosque where the temple used to be. And if the Jews ever tear down that mosque to rebuild the temple, it'll be Armageddon, I think, around the corner. Jerusalem is where it happens. But the first thing he does, he gets a city. Number 2, on C there, number C at the bottom, David rules over all Israel. All the tribes of Israel unite and anoint David king. David is 30 years old. Now that the king is enthroned and the people are united, God's work can be fully done. And this is the study I almost did. But when the king is on the throne and the nation is all surrendered in unity, 2 things happen. First bullet, internal strongholds can be conquered. That's what Jerusalem was. It was a city within the boundaries of the promised land that the Jews had never conquered. It was called a stronghold. Like things in our lives that we become children of God and yet there's a stronghold. Well, when the king is on the throne, those internal strongholds can be won. And second bullet, external threats can be defeated. And then there's this long story of another battle with the Philistines. And I don't know whether it's the Philistines or the Philistines. Anybody in authority on that one? I know I say it one time one way and one the other. Okay, we're on number 3. We're about to get, because what we're going to study tonight is chapter 6, and we're almost there. At last, David has the opportunity. So the nation is united. He has a capital city, and the Philistines are defeated. So this is the sort of the big stuff is out of the way. Now, what is the kingdom all about? And if you're a king after God's own heart, this is a big, big, big question. Why do we have a kingdom anyway? Good question. At last, David has the opportunity to lead Israel in the single action that will define them forever and make them distinct from all the other nations on the earth. What makes Israel distinct from all the other nations? I mean, David, this was in his DNA. Anybody want to take a stab on what it is? Is it her army? Is it her language? Is it what? God. God. Yes, God. It is. It is. That's a very good answer. If you'd have said Jesus, that would have been your Sunday school answer. But that would have almost worked. So, almost his first action. His first action was really to take Jerusalem and then to fight the Philistines. But once that's done, almost his first action is to bring the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark of the Covenant to its permanent resting place. For about 400 years, the Ark of the Covenant has been in a tent, moving from here to there. God is a mobile God. But David says, and God's not in disagreement. That's a double negative. He's not in disagreement. But I'm not sure how enthusiastic God was about a specific dwelling place that doesn't move. Because all the nations have a localized deity. Baal belongs to the Babylonians. Zeus belongs to the Greeks. And every nation has its own deity, but not the God of the Jews. But David says, yeah, but you need a resting place in my capital city, in not a tent, but a temple. I'm going to build you. Pretty important stuff. And God's not opposed to that, but he hesitates. And we're going to try to see some of that. But the heart of the temple is the Ark of the Covenant. So, in chapter 6, which is what we're doing tonight, tells the story of bringing the ark to Jerusalem. And chapter 7, which I think we're going to do next week, tells the story of David's desire to build the temple. And he has the desire, but then God tells him not to because your son's going to do it. But we're going to get to that. David says to God, I want to build you a house. God says to David, no, I want to build you a house. That's literally the language of chapter 7. Who's going to build who a house? And let me just tell you, give you a hint. God wins. God says, no, I'm building David's house. Then your son can build me a house. But we're first going to talk about David's house and David's lineage and David's son. And he's not just talking about Solomon. He's talking about Christmas, another son of David, okay? Now, let's just make a few notes on the Ark of the Covenant. I just went back and looked at this today to make sure I had it in mind. What is the Ark of the Covenant? Incidentally, when I was in Ethiopia a few years ago, I learned to my surprise that the Ethiopians claimed to have the Ark of the Covenant in Ethiopia. I said, you're kidding. Does Indiana Jones know this? I mean, it's like, I didn't know that. I said, well, but you can't see it. Of course, it's hidden in a temple, and only the priest can see it, and it's got all these kind of traditions, but it's very interesting. But supposedly, after the Babylonian exile, the ark ended up in Ethiopia. I don't mean to make light of serious traditions, but I didn't know that part of the story. The Queen of Sheba is from Ethiopia. Haile Selassie was supposed to be a son of Solomon and Sheba. There's some very interesting history in the Orthodox Christian Church of Ethiopia. That's another day. But note, the Ark of the Covenant was a rectangular box made of acacia wood. All of these pieces are interesting. That measured about 4 feet by 2.5 by 2.5. So, about like this? So, a box. It was covered in gold, carried by poles, remember that, inserted in rings at the 4 lower corners. Inside the ark were 3 objects, and all 3 of these are very interesting. The 2 tablets of the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments, a pot of manna, that's very interesting, and Aaron's rod. Why was Aaron's rod in there? Anybody remember that story? It bloomed because you had Korah's rebellion and all this stuff, and they said, we're all priests. Who do you think you are being priests over us? And God said, give me all your rods, and the one that sprouts almond branches or whatever it was is my priest forever. And Aaron's rod grew branches and leaves, and the people said, let's put that in the ark. We're going to remember that story. So we're not going to have this debate again about who's the appropriate high priest. But those were all in the ark. The lid of the ark, which was called the mercy seat, was made of gold with 2 cherubim at each end with outstretched rings. Hopefully you've studied this at some point in your life and you've sort of got an image. This is a quote from Exodus 25, verse 22. God says about the cherubim and the 2 wings stretched over the mercy seat, there I will meet with you. Between the wings of the cherubim, above the mercy seat where the blood was covering the law and the demands of the law. I mean, it's all very symbolic. But between the wings, above the mercy seat, in that space, God says, that is my dwelling place. That's where I meet with you. That's where I am. That's where the Shekinah, the glory, is. There I will meet with you, and from above the mercy seat, from between the two cherubim that are on the ark of the testimony, I will meet with you. So this is the box that David wants to bring to Jerusalem. And David has already built a palace for himself, and he's a little embarrassed because he lives in a palace and God lives in a tent. He says, we got to fix this situation. So he's going to bring the ark. This box was much more than an artistic piece of liturgical furniture. It was the dwelling place of God. Whoever had the box had God. I'm putting it pretty crudely there. This is certainly how Hophni and Phinehas and the Philistines understood it. Now, if I had time, we would go back to 1 Samuel 4 and 6 and read the story. One of my favorite stories. Hophni and Phinehas were the wicked sons of Eli, who was not a very godly priest himself. The Philistines are attacking. The Israelites are not doing very good. So they said, the priests and the people, we need our God in the box. I'm choosing my language. To take to battle so we won't lose anymore. Because if we have our God in the box, we'll win. It's like a magic lamp. If you rub it right and say the right words, our God will come out and beat your God. They take their God in the box into battle, and what happens? They lose, and worse, the Philistines capture the God in the box. And they take it off to Gath or whatever city they're taking it to. When Eli hears of the news, he's fat, he falls over backward, breaks his neck, and dies. Hophni and Phinehas are killed in the battle. Phinehas' wife, who's pregnant, goes into early labor. She bears a baby boy and names him, come on, help me. You got to know this one, Ichabod. Ichabod, which means kabod, it means glory. The I is the privative. The glory is gone. If our God in the box is gone, there's no glory in Israel. If the Philistines own our God in the box, Ichabod. This is really a good, you need to know these stories. The Philistines take the God in the box and put it in their temple's house, Dagon. They get up in the morning and Dagon has fallen on his face in front of the God in the box. I'm adding some. They prop him up. They said, oh, that's embarrassing. The next morning they come in and Dagon's head is cut off and his hands are cut off. Prostrate before the God in the box. And then the Philistines start having a problem. Anybody remember what the King James version of their problem is? Hemorrhoids. I can't tell you what a good story this is. They says, we don't like this God in the box. He gives us hemorrhoids. It's like, you couldn't make these stories up. You could not make them up. So they put the ark, the God in the box, what? On what? An ox cart. Remember that. These pagans put the God in the box on an ox cart, and they said, well, if he's really a God in the box, he can tell these cows which direction to go. And so the cows go straight back to Israel. take God back. So that's the background to what David is doing. Now, I'm calling it a God in the box with tongue in cheek, because the one we worship is not a God in the box. You can't crank the pop goes the weasel and God comes out like a magic genie. But I do think Uzzah came close to thinking that way. And I do know there are many Christians today who, though they would deny it when they heard me talk about it like I'm talking about it, that is what they believe about God. If I say the right words and do the right formula and do the right stuff, God will have to perform the way I think he's supposed to perform, because he's my God in the box. Okay? That's why this story is so good. David's better on it, but David's, I think, is a little, his theology is getting into shape, because he thought Well, if they put it on an ox cart, I can put it on an ox cart. We're going to see this story. Okay. Let's read the story. How are we doing? We're doing good. We're in chapter 6. This is our lesson for tonight, all right? 2 Samuel 6. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of Yahweh of hosts. When Lord is in all caps, it's the personal name for God, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. You hear it? And it's not covered. It's just exposed. And I don't know whether there was a bright light between the wings. It'd be interesting to know what was going on. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart. And I don't know when carts with wheels were invented, but we're at about 1000 BC here. This is pretty much state-of-the-art technology. It's a great way to carry your God in the box. I mean, it's I don't know how you could, it's state-of-the-art. Philistine technology, by the way. Do you want to carry your God in the box by using Philistine technology? That's a pretty important question. They carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before. And David and all the house of Israel were making merry before the Lord with songs, lyres, harps, tambourines, castanets, and cymbals. That's a very interesting list. The Chronicles adds trumpets. And when they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to the ark of God and took hold of it because the oxen stumbled. The God in the box was about to fall in the mud, it appears. The oxen stumbled. The ark is falling. Uzzah does a very natural thing. We don't want God to fall. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down because of his error. And he died beside the ark of God. And David was furious. Depressed. The word is angry, and it's the same word used for God. God was angry at Uzzah. David is angry at God. You messed up our celebration here. And what are we doing this? We're just trying to bring our God in the box to its resting place. What have we done wrong? And I think he just sort of goes into depression. Okay, hold on to that. I don't know. He should have. He should have. And whether it was willful ignorance or unwillful ignorance, I'm not sure. But he should have known Philistine technology is not the way Yahweh wants to be. Well, hold on. Let's see if we answer it. You're asking the right questions. You're asking the right questions. David was angry because the Lord had burst forth against Uzzah. And that place is called Perez Uzzah to this day. And David was afraid. I'll bet he was. I'll bet everybody was afraid. What kind of... Remember the passage in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe when Lucy gets into the house of Mr. and Mrs. Beaver, and the Beavers... I'm getting a lot of blank faces here. But the Beavers begin to talk to her for the first time about Aslan. Who's Aslan? Well, he's a lion. And he's the king. And Lucy says, is he safe? And Mrs. Beaver says, safe? He's a lion. Of course he's not safe, but he's good. It's so powerful. But I think of that when I think of Uzzah. He's not a safe God. He's not a God in the box. He does not perform on command. He's a person. And David was afraid of the Lord that day, and he said, How can the ark of the Lord come to me? So David was not willing to take the ark of the Lord into the city of David. And David took it aside to the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite. Now, I'm not sure who the Gittites were, but I think they were Philistines. But I think this just happened to be a house in the neighborhood where this incident took place, and David sort of said, I'm done. You keep the God in the box, Obed. Well, what happens to Obed-Edom? And the ark of the Lord remained in the house of Obed-Edom the Gittite 3 months, and the Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household. This is such a good story. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. So every 6 steps, there's an ox killed and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might. And David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. Let me keep going. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, now do you remember Michal? Michal is Saul's daughter. Actually, it says she loved David. And she helped David escape at night when her daddy was trying to kill him. She said, get out the window quick, and she's the one who put the goat head in bed so Saul, her daddy, would be confused. But she loved David. But when David fled into the wilderness, Saul took Michal and had her married to a guy named Paltiel, I think it is. And so she's married to somebody else. When David comes back to Hebron and Abner says, we want to join you, David says, first, give me my wife back. In fact, turn back to chapter 3, verse 12. And Abner sent messengers to David on his behalf, saying, to whom does the land belong? Make your covenant with me. My hand shall be with you. Verse 13. And David said, good, I will make a covenant with you, but one thing I require of you, that is, you shall not see my face unless you first bring Michal, Saul's daughter, when you come to see my face. Then David sent messengers to Ishbosheth, Saul's son, saying, give me my wife, Michal, for whom I paid the bridal price of 100 foreskins of Philistines. And Ishbosheth sent and took her from her husband Paltiel, the son of Laish. But her husband went with her, weeping after her all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go home. And he went home. So this story, I don't know what to do with all these pieces. They're just very interesting. Michal's David's wife now. Verse 16, back in chapter 6. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. Now she is royal blood. She's a blue blood. Her daddy's the first king. And she looks at her husband, who's acting like a fanatic, a maniac, dancing in the streets with all the slave girls in his ephod, so that, as John Oswalt used to say, his underwear was showing. I'm not making this up. I'll get to that part. It's not very dignified. And she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of the host. and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. And David returned to bless his household. So he's going to meet his wife. Now, he's got a number of wives. Bathsheba's not in the picture yet, but he's got Abigail, Ahinoam. There are several in his house. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, now you've got to have sarcasm in your voice when you read this verse, how the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself before the eyes of his servants, female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself. This is we could see your underwear while you were dancing. He was in a robe, dancing with all of his might. And she said, that's vulgar, that's common. You're one of the riffraff. You can hear the cynicism in her. And David said to Michal, I was dancing before the Lord, not before you, Miss Smarty Pants. That's my own translation. It was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all of his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will make merry before the Lord. I'll make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you've spoken, by them shall I be held in honor. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children till the day of her death. You have to love Scripture. It's just so powerful. Okay, let's see if we can make some sense out of this. I'm going to suggest to you that what this is about is worship, true worship. And I just said, you better wear a helmet. This passage is most instructive about true worship. Its purpose, the purpose of worship, the nature, the practice, and the participants. In a day when worship wars have defined many local congregations, I would love to share stories around the room about, show me your scars from the battle of 1997 in whatever worship battle you were in when you moved the drum set to the platform, you know. Let's talk about that. And some of us have wounds to show, oh, yeah, I was in that battle. But in a day when worship wars have defined many local congregations, this chapter is very helpful for those who, like David, passionately desire God's manifest presence. I don't know who I first heard use the term manifest presence, but I liked it. It's not just a theological awareness that, oh yeah, we believe in the omnipresence of God. But manifest presence is, he's here. I'm aware of it. I feel it at some level. David's all about that. It's the presence. It's the glory. It's the Shekinah. It's the one who dwells between the wings of the cherubim. We need to know he's here. And that's what worship is when we're dealing with that. Okay, so we're going to talk about the purpose of worship, the nature of worship, the practice of worship, and the participants. All right? And quickly, because my time's run out. The purpose of worship is the why question. Let's pause. Wait. The why question. Why? In other words, why do we worship? We're going to ask the what is worship, the who worships, but the first is the hardest one. Why do we worship? Let's pause to personally answer this most important of all questions. Before we define worship or discuss styles of worship, let's first ask why we worship in the first place. What's the purpose? Would you take just a moment and just, why do you worship? No, you're not going to turn this in. I'm not asking how do you worship or when do you worship Or even who do you worship? Why? American evangelicals tend to love the how question. I'm so tired of the how question. I really like the why question. I think if we can get the why right, we'll all figure out the hows. Whether you worship with pipe organs or kazoos actually matters very little if you get the why right. But whether it's pipe organs or kazoos and you don't know the why, it doesn't matter. It's just maybe you like bluegrass music more than 4-part harmony. Okay, I would love to hear some of your answers, but I'm fearful of time, so I'm going to keep going. But I wanted you to get in touch with your own thoughts about why. Now let's try to answer why David, in the terms of 2 Samuel 6. Although Scripture does not specifically state David's motivation for bringing the ark to Jerusalem, it is not difficult to discern his purpose. He desperately and passionately desires God's, and I'm going to give you several terms here, presence, the one who dwells between the wings. Does anybody know the Hebrew word behind the English translation's presence? When God says to Moses, "My presence will not go with you." Anybody know the word that can also be translated there? It's my face. My face. That's my other blank. My face. David was all about not the hand of God, the face of God. Face to face. That's his presence. But it's in Hebrew, it's more literal than presence. It's face. And we're thinking of all the verses that said, anyone who sees God's face will die. Well, Moses didn't, and those who saw Jesus didn't. It's a deeper question. Or another blank there is glory. The Shekinah glory is what was between the wings. Ichabod is when the glory was gone. There's no glory in Jerusalem if the ark is not there. Read the book of Ezekiel, where the glory left the temple. I mean, it left the temple. And then the Babylonians came. I mean, it's terrifying to think of Jerusalem without the ark. If you're a Jew, it's like there's no glory. It's just another city, like Nineveh, like Rome. But if God, that's why David wanted the ark there. We're not like other people. Jerusalem's not like another city. God's presence is there. And the last blank I have there is blessing. He wants God's blessing, which is another way of saying his presence, his face, his glory. More important than military strength, economic prosperity, political unity, or artistic renaissance, David knew that unless God's favor was on his kingdom, it was all vanity. It's just, we're just another political entity on the rubbish heap of human history. But if God's glory's here, when his first attempt failed, David tried again when he learned that the Lord had blessed the household of Obed-Edom because the ark was stationed at his house. If seeking God's blessing becomes a means of self-advancement, because what I'm saying here is we should seek God's blessing, but unfortunately many today equate seeking God's blessing with seeking my self-advancement. That's not what David was doing, and it's certainly not what I'm advocating. But if seeking God's blessing becomes a means of self-advancement, then the purpose of worship has been grossly perverted. But when God's blessing is sought, so we can experience a face-to-face relationship with Him, so that we can then pour out our lives in blessings to others, then we begin to grasp the why question, the purpose. To get face to face with God and to receive His blessings so I can pour out my life as a blessing. And let me just give you one verse, and it's one of my favorites, Psalm 67. May God be gracious to us and what? Bless us. Is that a good prayer? Lord, bless me. That's why I came to worship. Lord, bless me. Is that a good prayer? Well, if you read the rest of it, it's a very good prayer. But if you just stop and what I mean, Lord, is a new car or a bigger salary or it's all about me, that's not what worship is. May God be gracious to us and bless us and make His what? Face shine upon us. Why? Here's the reason, the purpose. So that your way may be known on the earth, your saving power among all nations. That's missions. This is a great missionary text. Lord, bless me. Lord, bless my finances so I can help finance your purposes in the earth. That's a great prayer. I actually think God likes to answer that question. Not bless my finances so I can retire early and play more golf during the last 3 decades of my life. I don't think that's the point. I know that's not the point. I'll be stronger. Okay? You with me? Let me keep going. B, the nature of worship. This is the what question. Definition. By examining David's practice, we begin to discover that worship is much more than pious contemplation or serenely reading through a liturgy. David's worship is passionate and emotional. It's multisensory. It's corporate. It involves the heart, the mind, and his body. It involves the arts. Music and dance are involved as well. I mean, it's all there in that story. Let me give you this definition. I heard this in seminary. I had to look it up today because I couldn't quote it. But William Temple was the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is the best definition I know of worship. I heard it, I'll bet, 35 years ago, and it's just stuck. To worship is to quicken the conscience by the holiness of God. To feed the mind with the truth of God. To purge the imagination by the beauty of God. To open the heart to the love of God. And to devote the will to the purpose of God. That is a wonderful definition. And in an ideal worship service, all of that's going on every time you worship. My conscience is being quickened. My mind is fed. My imagination, that's where the arts and the beauty come in, is purified. My heart is touched by love, and my will is surrendered. Lord, whatever your will be done. Then you're ready for the benediction. It's like, wow, we worshiped. That's worship. C, let's keep moving. The practice of worship. Now, this is where it's interesting. How question, the how question. And this is where worship styles come in. And this is where the worship wars are typically fought. Is it contemporary or traditional? Is it 4-part harmony or little praise choruses? Is it drums and guitars or pianos and organs? You know, these are all style. And if you go to Africa or India, you just put an exponential number behind this because it gets a whole lot more interesting when you add even other cultures. David soon discovered that how we worship God is important. In fact, it is a matter of life and death. Just ask Uzzah. You get it wrong, you die. I mean, this is really God? Good motives are not enough. And let me just assure you, Uzzah had good motives. Lord, I'm trying to help here. I'm trying to help. Good motives do not make good worship necessarily. More is involved. If our goal in worship is to feel better and sing songs we like, we'll never worship rightly. I learned pretty early on as a pastor when people walked out the door on Sunday morning and said, "Man, I loved worship this morning." What they meant was, I liked the singing. And it's like, what does that have to do with worship? Is that how we measure worship? By how we like the singing? How did we get there? Though David's purpose in worship was right, his practice was wrong, at least the first time. He needed to learn that you can't worship the Holy One in an unholy manner. You can't do it. We worship the God who's not a tame God. He's good, but he's not tame. And he's holy. And dealing with holiness is like dealing with nuclear radioactive particles. You better know what you're doing. Read the book of Leviticus if you don't believe me. 1, David's initial worship style. I'm going to call it worship style just to put it in terms that maybe relate to where we live. David's initial worship style was to put the ark on a new ox cart. And let me just say, this made perfect sense. This is how the Philistines had transported the ark years earlier. An ox cart was state-of-the-art science. Why not use Philistine technology to facilitate worship? Some of you are chuckling, and you're hearing my questions. And I don't have the answer. Don't think I'm coming off as Mr. Know-it-all on this. I'm just trying to ask the right questions. But a lot of worship is motivated today by Philistine technology. If our screens were bigger, we could worship better. It's like, really? Or if we had a smoke machine. Wow, we'd worship better. It's like, I don't think so. Whether you have a smoke machine or not, we can debate. But is that how we measure? By how technologically savvy we are? If we got a new soundboard, we could mix the sounds better. People talk like this. I know this is true. I've pastored churches where these conversations go on. This is how we think. This is Philistine technology. It's the ox cart. Do I sound passionate on this? This is very important stuff. At first, things went well. The people were making merry before the Lord with songs and lyres and harps and tambourines and castanets and cymbals. And I'm sure they were saying, "This is great worship. Man, this is great worship. We like the music. We like the style. We're in it." That's not bad. I'm just asking, is it worship? And what's the point? Because you could have a shot of whiskey and go out to a football game and sing songs and have some of those same emotions. Is that worship? No, but it's similar. Could be. What great worship. Then suddenly the situation changed, and I read these verses. When they came to the threshing floor of Nacon, Uzzah put out his hand to steady the ark, and the anger of the Lord was kindled, and God struck him down, and he died. David was so upset that he called off the worship service. He said, "Let's have the benediction and go home." At a loss to understand what had happened, David left the ark at the home of Obed-Edom, the Gittite, who lived near the place. So I think David at the moment was just, what happened? What happened? This is a short interjection. Number 3. Before dismissing this incident as one of those strange Old Testament stories, consider what happened to Ananias and Sapphira in the New Testament, Acts chapter 5. And if you remember the story, it was somewhere when they were singing "Praise God from whom all blessings flow" during the offering that Ananias just fell over dead in the aisle because he had lied to the Holy Spirit. Like, what's that about? And he's dead. And his wife comes in, and she dies too. That's a tough one to preach on, Quentin. That passage is like
Don't ask me when the last time I preached.
That's right. But don't think this is just an Old Testament weirdness sort of thing. This is a pattern. When the ark was coming to Jerusalem, God was starting a new era. In the book of Acts, God is starting a new era, and he wants to say something that nobody misses. This is serious, how you worship God. By placing these two stories in the opening events of the era, God apparently wants us to understand that, first bullet, it's not enough to worship. Pagans do that. I know people say, well, I've been to worship. Well, worshiped who? Worshipped what? Worshipped how? Worship is, pagans worship. Second bullet, it's not enough to worship the right God. Uzzah did that. Ananias and Sapphira, they weren't worshiping an idol. They were worshiping the true God. But third bullet, we must worship the right God in the right way. Well, Lord, you guys have to understand what went wrong in David's worship service, let's examine two passages from the Mosaic Law. The first one is, you shall make poles, Exodus 25, of acacia wood, and overlay them with gold, and you shall put the poles in the rings to carry the ark. You say, why didn't God let them carry it on an ark? I don't know. Maybe he's opposed to Philistine technology. I don't know. But all I know is he said, carry it with poles. And so you better say, yes, sir. Yes, sir. You're holy. It's your presence. I don't fully understand, but you want to be carried on poles, I'll carry you on poles. Reverently. Probably tiptoe. And sacrifice a bull every 6 steps I go, so I don't end up dead. As the camp sets out, number 4, the sons of Kohath shall come to carry the furnishings of the tabernacle, but they must not touch the holy things, lest they die. And as you can see, both of those were violated. Look at number 5. I'm going to wind up here. You guys have been so patient, and I want you to read. Anybody know Annie Dillard? Anybody read Annie Dillard's stuff? Yeah, she doesn't quite connect with me always, but she's interesting. But this is the quote worth having. It's number 5. I'll read the intro. Worshipping the Holy One is a bit like handling radioactive material. If you don't know what you're doing, you might get hurt. This is serious business, so be careful. But here's Annie Dillard's quote. Does anyone have the foggiest idea what sort of power we so blithely invoke? Or, as I suspect, does no one believe a word of it? The churches are children playing on the floor with their chemistry sets, mixing up a batch of TNT to kill a Sunday morning. It's madness to wear ladies' straw hats and velvet hats to church. We should all be wearing crash helmets. Ushers should issue life preservers and signal flares. They should lash us to our pews, because the sleeping God may wake someday and take offense, or the waking God may draw us out to where we can never return. It's just a good quote. I thought about doing that at Loudonville one day, just handing out signal flares or have the ushers install seat belts on the pews. Just say, God may show up today. We better be ready. The who question. With this, I'm done. All right? There are 3 main characters in this story which illustrate 3 kinds of people that are typically in every worship service. They're always there. There's a David, there's a Uzzah, and there's a Michael. This is good. David is the true worshiper. Though it took more than one try and cost him dearly, David finally got it right. We know this because he danced before the Lord with all of his might. David learned the importance of worshiping God in spirit and in truth. That's how Jesus said it. Those who worship the Father must worship in spirit, which I think relates, at least in part, to emotions. Your heart must be in it, and with truth.
What do you think that means?
What does truth mean? Worship rightly, the way He demands. Let me see if I answer it. Let me see if God has given clear instructions so that we can boldly and with confidence enter the very throne room of heaven. You may if you draw the conclusion from what I'm saying today, oh, I better tiptoe around God. It's like, no. You can go boldly right into the throne room if you go in truth, if you go the right way. Okay, here, the architecture and furnishings of the tabernacle are meant to educate us how to do it. For example, this is a whole nother session. There's a single gate. Jesus said, I am the door. You can't worship God unless you're doing it in the name of Jesus. You can't worship Him rightly. You can try, you can have emotion. After you get in the gate of the tabernacle, the first thing you meet is the altar. That's where blood is shed. Without the shedding of blood, there's no forgiveness of sins. Then there's the basin for washing. Then there's the holy place and the table of bread. And then there's the most holy place, the Ark of the Covenant, the face of God. But that's really what I am saying about truth. You have to approach God the way God says He's to be approached. And that's what the tabernacle and the temple is. And when you go the right way, there's freedom, there's boldness, there's confidence. Uzzah is the second person that's in every worship service. He's there, or she. This is the misguided worshiper. Though motives are good, the approach wasn't. He tried to worship God in his own way. Uzzah is the patron saint of all those who are enamored with Philistine technologies and user-friendly styles of worship. He's the patron saint. In reality, Uzzah was not worshiping God, but he was worshiping his own God-in-a-box. If I get it right, God will come out and do what He's performed. He felt if he went through the right motions, God would automatically pop up and perform on command. God struck Uzzah dead, so all would understand we must worship the Holy One according to the methods He has prescribed. And then the third person who's lurking somewhere in your worship services, hope it's not one of us, is Michael, the non-worshiper. There's a Michael lurking in every worship service. And let me just say, sometimes she shows up in my own heart. I know this woman. I know her attitude and what she feels when she watches people get emotional about their worship. I know this woman. I sometimes have been this woman. There's a Michael lurking in every worship service. She's not there to worship, but rather to watch others as they worship. She despises David and those who are like him, filled with cynicism, sarcasm, and condescension. Michael looks down her spiritual nose at the emotionalism of the riffraff who worship in such an unsophisticated manner. Guys, I gave you bucket loads tonight. I enjoy this. I hope it's not too much. What I want us to do is let's quote Psalm 24 together. Let's read it together, and this will be our closing. David wrote this psalm. I don't know when he wrote it, but it really fits. It talks about blessing. It talks about how to approach God. It's real short, but let's read it together. Some of you maybe could quote parts of it. Let's stand together. Can we do that? Let's do that. This will be our closing benediction. The earth is the Lord's, and the fullness thereof, the world and those who dwell therein. For he has founded it upon the seas, and established it upon the rivers. Who shall ascend the hill of the Lord? And who shall stand in his holy place? He who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not lift up his soul to swear false, and does not swear deceitfully. He will receive blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek the face of the God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, O gates, and be lifted up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord, mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, O gates, and lift them up, O ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord of hosts. He is the King of glory. Amen. Good stuff. God bless you. See you next week.